in the Stop the War movement, you know, they had, what was it, 500,000, 1 million people in Hyde Park. What did they do with them? They're like the Duke of Wellington, you know, march them up at a Duke of York.
Duke of York.
Duke of York.
Get
March
us
them
right.
to the top of the hill,
Yeah,
march them down again, you know. That's the way they operate. So I don't go for that. I think you have to try and create some structure of democratisation. Plus the fact, if you've got 500,000 people, why don't you just take over the Labour Party?
Exactly.
There's only 100,000 members of the Labour Party. Take it over.
Yeah.
They should have turned around on that meeting and said, now, I know you don't like the way the Labour Party's run, so let's pledge that 500,000 people or 100,000 people will join the Labour Party today and compel them to do what you want. That's, I think, the methodology that is more realistic as an approach and more tactically appropriate than trying to, you know, replace the Labour Party with some phantom left-wing coalition. I just think it's just a more strategically and tactically viable method of approaching change. Doesn't mean it will happen that way, but I think that's the approach you should take, because then people will follow what you're doing, you know, and then they can engage in that type of battle.
I was reading Doris Lessing's book this week, The Golden Notebook, which is set just after the 20th Party Congress, where Khrushchev denounced Stalin, and it's set in characters in the British Communist Party, and having all these conversations that we're still having today, you know, where these people are saying, oh, you know, we should break away from the CPGB, set up another group, and someone's like, no, you'll just spend all your time arguing with each other about which group is communist and which isn't, you know.
Well, there's a funny point on that, which is actually that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the communist parties in the Eastern Bloc, at the time, all the Trotskyist groups, bar one, thought that you should not be inside the communist parties, that these communist parties will just collapse and a new revolutionary communist party will emerge. I didn't know, that's what I believed myself at the time, but as it turned out, it was just rubbish.
Well, it did
But,
turn out.
but, let me just clarify, but where there was serious opposition, tended to emerge from within the Communist Party. And then if a new Communist Party came about, it came about as a split from that Communist Party, from the large state Communist Party. And actually the only ones who had a tactic like that, to be fair, was the WRP. They used to have sleepers inside the Communist Party, in Britain, for example, like who would wait. They would pretend to be loyal members, and then they would wait for the right moment. And then, like when 56 came, for example, they would, side with the Hungarians or whatever. So I think that is actually a viable methodology if you think about it long term, rather than just imagining that there'll be some revolutionary awakening which will create everything from new. I don't think that's a general dynamic. There are some places in the world where that might happen, but in countries which are long-standing structures of workers' organisations, that's true. And it was also, and I think by default it is also true, in, for example, Cuba or China or Vietnam or even North Korea, that if you wanted to build a Marxist organisation that would have influence on the revolutionary process in those countries, I think it would have to be within the existing communist parties. I don't think you're going to get any influence otherwise. Occasionally some dissidents do, but that's about it.
If you look at the collapse of the Soviet Union and other satellite countries, it happened very quickly, over a matter of months. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, you had all the satellite countries collapse straight away. Now, what's happening in the Middle East? You have a sort of contagion program, and the collapse or the change is much slower. So can one deduce from that where you have a strong central power ruling, that a collapse is much quicker?
Well, you might deduce from that, but if you look at the time scale involved, I think that's not quite accurate. Firstly, the collapse in Eastern Europe began with East Germany. I mean, the first major protest demonstrations were East Germany in the summer, autumn of 89. The collapse of the Soviet Union was 1991, August 1991. So you got 2 years. There wasn't a mass protest movement in Poland in 1989.
Solidarity? No, prior to that.
This was 1980, 80,
Yeah,
81.
Poland happened before the Soviet Union.
There was an election in Poland in June 89, but there were no mass social unrest in Poland in 1989. In fact, there was none in 89, 89, 1991 in Poland.
Poland was quite stable, yeah.
Poland had been very silent precisely because Solidarity had been defeated in conflict in 1981. So there wasn't any major conflict there. Sorry? What's that?
In Vatican.
Yeah, but I'm not arguing about what the character of the Polish movement was. I'm not arguing about the character of the Polish movement or any of the movements in Eastern Europe. He asked me about upheaval and transformation, about centralisation as a determining factor in the speed of transformation, rather than about the character of the movements themselves. That's a separate debate, which is open to discussion, but it's a separate debate. There were different directions within the movements in '89. Some of them were going to the left, but in general, as it turned out, the movements, even if they started with a left-wing face, adopted a right-wing face quite quickly. So that, if you like, touches on that question. In relation to the Middle East, I think you've got a dual process as well. You have, or North Africa and Middle East, you've got some movements that are tending towards socio-economic questions, which have the potential to turn into socialistic movements. On the other side, but are focused on democracy. On the other side, you've got reactionary movements, the jihadists and so on, like in Libya or Syria, who are backed by imperialism and seeking to anchor their position. But in terms of the time scale of the dynamics of spreading of revolution, I think the Near East and North Africa have quite a similar time scale dynamic to what happened in the Soviet Union, or Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Having said that, I missed one point, instead of which you reminded me of. Of course, actually, it wasn't East Germany; it was China in 1989 that began. It was Tiananmen, the protests on Tiananmen in February, March till June '89. They began and they were defeated first of all, and then East Germany came after that. So there were different directions, as I said, in which the process took place. I don't think the timing's actually accurate what you say. 1848, the revolutions broke out in January, February 1848. By winter of 1849, they're all defeated. So you have waves of revolution in which similar causes give birth to revolutionary movements across many countries. I think that's the essential dynamic. It's not really, that you have the centralization. Although obviously, if the regimes are all very similar and under a similar structure, like the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, then the tendency is for them to be integrated together in many ways. But for example, there was a guy here from Romania a few minutes ago. When Romania broke out in December '89, Romania, you might got to remember, was not a Soviet satellite. Romania was independent of the Soviet Union. One time they supported China, another time they Albania as well. Albania was not a pro-Soviet, or Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is independent from the Soviet Union. So there were quite distinct processes. Yeah. But with similar causes, the point, if you have similar causes and similar dynamics, then upheaval can appear to be of a similar character. And so that's why the Western powers are able to use the general discussion that they have and say, oh, it's about democracy, or it's about freedom. They use a generic terminology to try and capture the whole movement and associate it with their own society. So they want what we've got. That's the idea.
But I think the fact that America wants Europe on side to be a stronger Europe indicates that they realise the weakness of having one central power.
No, it's mostly because we're just too cheap.
What?
It's mostly just because we're cheap.
I think the Americans
they want to work with a stronger Europe.
I don't think there is actually a very specific and defined plan in relation to the so-called stronger Europe. I don't think the Americans actually support a stronger Europe. One example of that would be the events in Yugoslavia. A stronger Europe in terms of German-French opinion would encompass a stronger military force, a stronger police system, a unified economy, unified state effectively. And the United States doesn't really support that. In Yugoslavia, for example, when conflict broke out in Yugoslavia, the French were very heavily involved in discussions around the Kosovan deal, I believe it was. And they'd made agreements to try and stabilise the situation. The Americans intervened to overturn what the French diplomacy had done, because it served their interest to undermine the position of Europe in terms of unified military and strategic policy.
Are you talking about the Dayton Accords?
I believe it was a Rambouillet Accord originally. No, not Rambouillet Accord. No, there were discussions taking place between the French and the local forces.
Which local forces? The Bosnians, the Serbs, or the Croatians?
It was the Serbs or the Yugoslavians and the Kosovans. And as far as I remember, was this, that the Americans then intervened to undermine those agreements, and then in order to involve NATO in a military operation.
So you're talking 99, not
1999.
broke up a lot earlier.
Yes,
Kosovo
well,
was 99.
Yugoslavia wasn't broken up until after 1999. Yugoslavia still existed as a state. It wasn't the same size of state. It wasn't the same size of state. They had lost Croatia, they had lost Bosnia, but Yugoslavia as a state still existed, of which Kosovo was part of Yugoslavia.
You mean Serbia?
No, you mean Serbia, but Serbia was only a component of Yugoslavia. Kosovo
was a
was...
collection of Slavs.
Sorry?
Yugoslavia was an artificial construction
I'm-
entirely.
Even after 1999, Yugoslavia.
I am
Lots of countries are in
All I was saying-
artificial constructions, aren't
You
they?
question...
This one is.
You question me in relation to the name Yugoslavia. The name Yugoslavia as a state still existed in 1999. I can't remember when they got rid of it. It's quite recent.
2002, when Montenegro.
So we're dealing with the name of a state. We're not dealing with whether you think that has moral legitimacy or not, or whether it has legitimacy in the eyes of the other Slavs. I mean, that's not a decisive question. It was a state as existed. Many countries recognised it. They said they were the continuation of the former Yugoslavia.
Get back to the foreign policy. Don't you think it is more viable for America to deal with unified Europe in terms of the foreign policy and sphere of influence, and spreading the American, what you call the democracy, rather than dealing with 5 positions, and all of them trying to influence, and all of them trying to gain their whatever is spreading their influence. So I think at the moment, but in the long term, it is not. I think it's more reasonable to American interest to deal with one Europe, united Europe, and one foreign policy. I'm not sure.
I don't think there is a specific American policy in relation to that long term. I think there's a split analysis, and they probably have to do that because they don't know if Europe could unite in any case. Secondly, I think that the military. Would you mind, John? What's the point? As I was saying, if the military of Europe were to become a united force, then Europe itself would be a threat to America. Okay? So, for this reason, I don't think they have a policy that there should be a united, independent European state with a European army and European power.
It will be contained. We know the American power are more stronger than Europe in terms of the air power and the industry and technology and investment. So that Europe can be contained. But the key thing is to contain Europe and having with one foreign policy, dealing with one foreign policy, rather than with 4 big power who are trying and having at each other.
I mean,
as well.
it's partly speculative, but I don't think so. Firstly, because America's primary support is Britain, and Britain is a Trojan horse in Europe. Second, one little point, just amending what you were saying, industry and investment is greater in Europe than it is in America. European economy is significantly larger than America. I think nearly twice the size of American economy. The European economy is much larger than America. So if the European economy was a united force and could remain a united force, then America's position is undermined. So this is another...
I think that's true. Yes, that's perfectly true. But that can be dealt with. That can be dealt with by containing, by export, import, and so on.
I don't think America's actually...
All speculative anyhow.
I don't think America's actually in a position to dictate to many people in the world at all. I think America's in a very weak position at the moment.
Certainly not in the Middle East anymore.
Not at all, but largely not. I mean, they're being undermined, their position's being undermined, and their old points of support are also undermined. So they have to rearrange the deck of cards that they're playing in order to gain any influence again. One of those factors, for example, is the way in which they respond. The Egyptian army was their tool. Now it's no longer their tool. So the danger for the Americans is that they lose their position. But they're internally, the main problem for the United States is internal. That's what they want. They would like to get out of Afghanistan. They'd like to run away from the Middle East if they could. And in a way, they'd prefer Europe get on with itself. But actually, in the soul of the beast, there are two souls. On the one side, they seek control because any major imperial power in history that has a dominant position seeks to maintain its position. It's a natural phenomenon. The big boy wants to stay on top. On the other side, there's limits in what they can do. The same thing in relation to China. The United States would like China to fall apart, or to have some, democratic revolution, look like India, or Africa. But actually, at the same time, the Chinese have got them by the ghoulies economically, and there's not much they can do about the Chinese. They don't actually have the power to undermine China's expansion. And probably China's already overtaken America economically. This year or last year, some estimates are calculated.
Up in the next 5 is the last one.
Well, it depends there's a guy called Carsten Holzer, senior sinologist in Chinese affairs. He calculates, he's quite well respected, he calculates China has already overtaken America. It's a moot point, but it's either happened or within the next few years it will happen. In terms of total production, now total production not the decisive question. I mean, China was the biggest total producer in 1750 as well. But it wasn't the dominant power in the world. So it doesn't automatically follow that highest production equals dominant power. But in modern times, it'll upset the balance of the United States of America. And you can see that what we discussed earlier on. A few years ago, I think it was only 5 years ago, I was reading about Chinese power in Africa. And there was an American military document, analysis of Chinese soft power in Africa. And it was like, the Chinese have given a tiger to, I think it was Ethiopia, so we have to do things like this. But nowadays, Chinese influence in Africa has multiplied exponentially and completely undermined the United States' position in relation to Africa. Many more countries in Africa and more people in Africa look positively on China than they do on the United States of America. And the United States of America, to be fair, has had a free hand to influence African affairs for 50 years, more than 60 years. And yet they've undermined their own position by their imperialist policy in relation to the African states.
I would agree with you on the northeast side of Africa, but saying the whole of the continent, where there's U.S. influence all across the continent, but Chinese influence only in the northeast, mostly for mineral extraction.
I don't think it's only in the northeast, but the point was not a geographical question. I was talking about an attitude of the people towards the way in which the state operates in relation to their country.
Sure, but
so, for example,
only in 12% of Africa, And you made a sweeping assertion that all of Africa.
I said the people and their attitudes of the states towards China. And there's a Pew survey, for example. I think it was 65% of the population or more said that they had a positive attitude towards China. And it was far lower in relation to America.
What about American and European cooperation beyond Iranian policies? Because they are all together with policies beyond Iran policies. What about the American and European cooperation, collaboration beyond Iranian policy? Because you said there is some separation between European countries and the United States. But you see that they took collaborative action beyond Iran. How do you explain it?
I mean, these are state coalitions that temporarily form around specific objectives. Plus, the United States and Europe are the dominant capitalist powers in the world, so they occasionally have collaborative interests which are connected with this. But for example, in relation to the Snowden revelations, basically the British, on behalf of the Americans, spied on the Europeans. And the Europeans are well aware of this. There was a survey carried out last week in Germany where German business said the main threat to Germany is the United States spying on technical knowledge of the German industry. So here you have an example of a rising consciousness of their national interest of Germany, which is very much reflected in the European Union and the battle inside the European Union, vis-à-vis the United States of America. The only problem is that the Germans don't feel powerful enough, the German state doesn't feel powerful enough to actually enter a conflict with the United States of America, because they think they sink or swim together. And the Americans have got that much intelligence information on German authorities that they can bring down governments in Europe quite easily. The illustration of that was a couple of weeks ago when the French turned around and said, when the French apologised to Evo Morales for bringing down his plane and kidnapping him on behalf of the Americans, the next day the Americans released information that the DSA, the intelligence services of France, have been spying on all French citizens, undermining the position of the French government. So here you have an example of the capacity of American intelligence agencies, which are not all that intelligent, but they've got the name, to undermine the authority of other governments if they feel that those governments are going against American interests. That's why I think that happened. I mean, you might disagree, but I think that's why the timing was a bit too precise. The way in which the European countries. Sorry?
Did the French government fall?
But it undermined their position. It didn't bring down the government, but it undermined their position.
That's diplomacy as it's been conducted for the past 400 years.
Well, I'm not denying that. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the way diplomacy is organised.
Don't you think in the process China will have the similar fate as another state? Obviously with a different population, different scale and different time, different level of technology and invented and more invention and different assets of economy, but same fate will be on the Chinese in the future. The integration, the amount and intensity of the integration of the world economy will be having the same effect on China.
Well, again, to understand the dynamics of the relationship between major powers and the world, you really have to start with the internal dynamics of the society. People mystify concepts, the nation, Britain. That's why the average Joe, they'll talk about Britain. Well, it's in our interest to go to Iraq, or it's in our interest to go to Libya, And in this way, the mystified relationship is created between the individuals within society, within the nation, and the foreign policy of that country. It mystifies the actual relationships, which are based on economic, political, military ties of a class structure of capitalism. So, this is the fundamental basis for understanding the dynamics. Now, in relation to China, we have a slightly different dynamic. China is not dominated by capitalism. It's dominated by public ownership of the largest industries and the banks. The Communist Party rules through, an example I was going to give was this. Even though China has a very large capitalist sector of the economy, bigger than any other country in the former Soviet regimes ever had. Well, apart from the Soviet Union in the 1920s. But if you conceptualize Europe as being dominated by France and Germany, I don't think many people would dispute that. France and Germany is Europe. You know, there are other countries, they have their word, but their word is pretty irrelevant. If France and Germany want to do, it is done. So too, the total workforce in France and Germany, I think, is around 70 million, right? 70 million, correct me if I'm wrong, 70 million. Someone can wiki it. 70, maybe 80 million, that's about it. Total workforce. Now, in China, the total workforce for the state is 110 million. So, here you have the dominant sector within China is the Communist Party and its state-owned enterprises and banks. And they dominate China just as surely as France and Germany dominate Europe. And so that dynamic of the way in which that state sector of the economy and the party control the society determines the dynamic of foreign policy of China as well. And so China's policy is to gain influence, win friends and gain influence around the world. How do they do that? Well, Deng Xiaoping, he said, peaceful rise. So in other words, they don't focus on a military confrontation with America. They focus on gradually gaining influence across the entire planet, serving their own economic interests of the state sector, which is about pacifying the working class. It's about maintaining internal stability inside China. Because the Chinese government, if it calls itself communist, it rules in the name of communism. 共产党, it means public ownership party. That's what it means. Without public ownership, no communist party. And so it's even in the constitution. The rule of public ownership is written into the party constitution and the state constitution. The country does not exist without public ownership dominating the economy. So the enhancement of public ownership and the improvement in the living standard of the majority is the bottom line for the existence of that state. If it doesn't do that, the state will be overthrown. Unlike in America or Britain. In Britain, you can carry out austerity for decades on end. And the people go, oh, our country's getting better. You know, now they're talking about what economic growth? What economic growth? Unemployment, poverty, wages of the workers. Wages of the workers was reported this morning in the newspaper. 5.5% fall in income since 2008. 5.5% since 2008. Now, do people not make anything? Do people not produce more? Are people not technically, scientifically, culturally more advanced than 5 years ago? Of course we are. But our living standards go down, while the wealthiest 10%, their living standards go up. So, this is the very structure of society under capitalism. And they don't even hide it. They turn around in Britain and they say, the wages of the wealthy must go up. Because they're the entrepreneurs, they're the Alan Sugars, they're going to create the future wealth. And the workers are getting paid too much because they have to compete against China. So that's the argument. An unstoppable logic is imposed that they turn around and say, reduce the wages of the workers, make more people unemployed, reduce the amount of social wage for the population, reduce welfare spending, and drive out the immigrants. So this whole agenda,
talking about communist clever,
based on lies and stupidity, is the foundation of the system because private ownership and private investment dominates the society. And therefore, this is the fundamental agenda. We must, written into the British state's constitution, of course there's no constitution, but it's unwritten constitution, in the framework of the entire legal system of the country, is the inalienable right to property, the inalienable right of the richest people in society to lord over the population. That's the very essence of capitalism and the United States and Europe. And therefore there are different internal dynamics in these countries than those in China. That's why I would argue that the Chinese foreign policy will also be a reflection of its internal policy. And that's why we discussed it a little earlier on, but I'll repeat it for those who are here. That is why in 15 years or 10 years of investment in Africa, China has done more for the development of Africa than the United States and Britain did in 200 years. Just in 5 years. So this is an illustration. I mean, look at the Congo. Thousands of miles of roads, thousands of miles of railways, schools, hospitals, universities, in exchange for copper. What did the British give to the Congo? The British went to the Congo, stole the copper, or better said, bought the copper, paid Mobutu. Mobutu transferred the money he got from the copper to London. So we got the copper and the money. And Congo got nothing. So this is the game. Sorry?
Congo was ruled
French,
by the
Belgium.
Dutch.
French Belgium.
What about low average wage and low income in China?
The basic principle.
What about low average income, low average wage in China? Because as we know, there is a lack of income distribution in China.
I mean, the argument we were told 5 years ago was that China's economy is based on low wages. That was the argument. That's how they're doing so well. Wages are so low. Actually, wages rose 20 to 30% last year. 20 to 30%. There's a shortage of labour in the country. Not a surplus, shortage of labour. Wages are rising. Not only are wages rising, but the social wages rising. They are building now, between 2011 and 2015, 36 million public sector houses, public sector apartments, housing 80 million people. Public council flats. Now, in Britain, when we say, where are the council flats? The government says you can't build council flats because housing must be private. In China, they're doing the reverse. They're building 36 million apartments. That's just in this 5-year plan. By the year 2015, there will be 300 million extra urban inhabitants in China. 300 million. The entire population of Western Europe in 10 years. So you get an idea of the scale of transformation carried out because China's economy is run by planning and public ownership, rather than dominated by them, rather than by private sector. That's why when the Americans invested after the collapse in 2008, they invested also $1 trillion in expansionary program. But all the money was thrown down the drain. Thrown down the drain because capitalists only invest if they can make a profit. So that's why they turn everything. We throw the money at the banks. The banks turn around and make a couple of quid, then they say we'll privatise them again. So and then we have to pay for the money we gave to the banks.
I totally agree with you, but I grew up in public housing in New York, and at the beginning it was very good. It was wonderful. From the slums that we came from, it was marvelous. The heat worked every day, the water was clean, it was lovely, but it degenerated. There needs to be something in between. We've done that. So China is maybe, 30 years behind us. In 30 years, I don't know what their affordable housing will look like. I also, now living in South Carolina, see the problem with lack of affordable housing. And the government is no longer building affordable housing for the folks. And it's also not working. I don't know what the answer is, but that's not it.
There is no rule about what public and private housing that must exist for all time. I agree. However, we can look at best practice across the world in public housing. And we can see there are many places where excellent public housing exists. We can look, for example, at parts of Germany is very good. Second,
it mustn't be free because if your income, we all knew we had to make a pretty good amount to get into the public housing, and it was this amount. But that if we lost our job or our income went down, that our rent went down. And if our rent went down to nothing, we had to pay nothing. And that is when it began to deteriorate. If there were a minimum amount so that people who are working at the minimum wage could afford to buy at 40 hours a week, one full-time minimum wage, could then afford to pay for the rent, but it mustn't go to nothing because that's when it falls apart.
You have an opinion on this? You have an opinion on this? We have a slightly different structure in Britain. At the moment, if you wander around London, one of the most prized possessions you can have is a council tenancy, right? One of the most prized possessions anybody's got in Britain. Nowadays, people scramble to get these if it's possible. Most places you can't get it. It's like gold dust. Why? Because if you get a council tenancy in London, you are set for life. Your life is completely transformed. Why is it transformed? Because you know your rent is fixed. It's not cheap, but it's not so expensive that you can't take a job and live a life like a normal human being. If you rent from the private sector, your life will be hell. Every 6 months to a year, you'll be kicked out of the place you live in. The landlords can arbitrarily raise the rents. The landlord's paying money to the banks to pay for the mortgages. In other words, you're completely strangled by the conditions of the so-called free market.
So in the Bronx, where I grew up before, the slums that I lived in, hold on, they were rent controlled, so that the landlord was limited to how much they could raise it.
In the
All around.
1980s.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sonny, I'm
In the
a lot.
1980s in Britain.
1950.
No, but in the
I was born
1980s.
in
Yeah, I understand it. But in the
So that the landlords then began to abandon the buildings because they weren't allowed to raise the rent enough to keep up the buildings, and they abandoned them. They walked away, and the things began to fall in. You've seen Fort Apache, the Bronx. That's where I lived.
Well, in the United States, there's a slightly different ideology associated with it, which I don't really want to go into, but I can offer some suggestions. I looked, for example, when I saw on the internet last week that a lot of Chinese people are buying houses in Detroit for $100. I looked on the internet to see whether I should buy one for myself as a part-time activity. And there are very big houses, 5-bedroom, 4-bedroom, some of them quite good. $100, $200, you go on the internet, there they are. You can buy them immediately, right? There they are. Not even 1 month's rent. This is because two factors. One is the economy of America is designed such that rapid mobility takes place when economic crisis happens. So a town goes bust, they leave the town, abandon it, let it run down and collapse, leaving only the poorest and most deprived people in those communities. Even in wealthy towns like Philadelphia. I went to Philadelphia a couple of years ago. I went to Temple University, 100 meters from Temple University, 100 meters. You go across the road, and I thought I was in worse than the third world. Worse than the third world. I was scared, literally scared. To walk. 4 or 5 buildings burnt out, then one building, someone living in it. And then the most dodgy looking people you've ever seen wandering around the area. So you feel scared, and you're justified to feel scared. That is a different dynamic to what we generally have in Europe. Generally in Europe, because we have a stronger public sector ethos and socialistic consciousness, we have a much larger support for public sector housing, public sector provision within the society. So I think there's a slightly different dynamic in the United States than there is in Europe. But they should adopt that type of dynamic in the United States, because it's completely pointless to allow cities to collapse when those cities can be regenerated on the basis of people moving in and setting up communities there. I mean, after all, America was set up originally by people going there and setting up new types of communities where new types of life were possible. Many of the original communities in the United States were actually communist communities set up over there. People left Europe to try and set up communist-spirited communities in the United States of America. Even Robert Owen, when he tried to set up a communist society, he went to the United States of America and tried to create it there. Because it was virgin territory, and people who believed in a cause could come together to create that. And that's what they should do with places like Detroit. If you're offered the opportunity of houses at only $100, the state should intervene to support people moving in there, creating new communities and new societies, rather than allowing the buildings to collapse and be destroyed and communities to fight each other. That's what I'd say.
What you're saying about Detroit. Can you tell me though, where does wealth come from? You just said that the state should come in and buy all the houses, but I'm interested to see, moving on to how we should rebuild Detroit. So where does wealth come from?
According to political economy, traditional political economy, and Marxist political economy, wealth comes from human labour power. In other words, you strip away the barest elements of which a society is constructed, or which the the human world that we live in is constructed. We have human beings with the capacity to shape nature,
People.
It comes from human beings making wealth with their brains and their hands. That's where wealth comes from. Now, under capitalism, the world is inverted. We are told wealth doesn't come from the labour power and brains of human beings. It comes instead from speculative activity. It comes from genius of one or two people. They make the world's wealth, and everybody else is subordinate to their will. That's the theoretical distinction between
capitalists who would disagree that wealth is produced from humans and individuals' ingenuity and intellect. What does confuse me about the communist ideal is that it seems to be more about how we would want to distribute this wealth that's created. So I would agree with you, and you sound to me obviously like a communist. Wealth is created from individuals and what they do. But it seems that communism goes a step further and says that a central organisation knows somehow how to use these people for an overall good.
The basic argument of Marxism is that when the scale of production and technology reaches a certain level of combining people into a division of labour in production, which it does today on a world scale. I'll give you the example again that I mentioned earlier. Out of 32,000 transnational corporations that control most of the world economy, 740 control 80% of the world economy, within the 32,000. So the majority of the world's economy is dominated by a few hundred companies.
So it's the greater good. Communism is the greater good. Is that the point you're making?
So once you get communistic concepts are related to specific circumstances. They're not some ahistorical concept which says at any time human beings could share the wealth out. The reason why Jesus Christ required a miracle to feed the 5,000 is because he didn't have food for 5,000, right? But if we have food for 5,000 or for 10,000 when 5,000 need feeding, the issue of distribution disappears. So we're not really concerned about distribution per se, we're concerned about production as the primary point of understanding.
Whose idea of distribution should we look to? One person in the crowd might want to distribute things in a different way to you. Who's right?
As I said, if you have shortage, distribution will necessarily be unequal. If you have surplus, you may have unequal distribution, but it can be irrelevant.
Who's going to dig the copper out of the ground? Who's going to be the farmer to plough the field?
I repeat, if you have surplus, the question disappears. If you have shortage, the question is acute. Let me give you one example from the news this week. You may have seen the news this week. The most expensive hamburger in the world was made. $250,000 to make a hamburger. The point was, actually I thought it was quite cheap. The point was that here we have the resolution of all vegetarianism. We have the resolution of the entire factory farming production system. And we also have the resolution of the food question. How do we feed the world? It's been resolved. That's what the hamburger means. We have no reason not to be able to feed the entire planet. The production costs when it enters into mass production will be far lower than beef. Far lower than beef. And there's no cow involved. So, the question is not the modern era poses different questions to the old era. Let me give you an example to understand. Just one second. Let you come back 1 second. I just got a train of thought I wanted to run through. Those of you who remember the world of 20 years ago will know that what I'm saying has validity. Audio, electronic data transmission, computing, telecommunications, they have all been utterly and completely transformed in 20 years. The technical and scientific development has transformed the entire planet. I lived in East Germany in 1989. Hardly anybody had a telephone. There were no fax machines. And printing, when we used to print things, we used to do it with a hand. Reproduce a leaflet, make it with your hand. Now all these things are electronic and universal across the entire world. So, that has utterly and completely transformed the economics of intercommunication, transmission, and of data, and of production through software.
It's basically the
microchip. It's the microchip and software.
Yeah.
And intercommunication. Now, if you would have said this to people 20 years ago, most of them would laugh at you. When Alvin Toffler made his predictions, third wave, most people say he's a bit of a nutcase. But actually this has all happened. Now, if you understand the way in which technology is developing, in particular nanotechnology and stem cell technology, which is part of what we've seen with the beef production, then you will also understand that the primary problems that humanity faces, in a technical sense, are not problems of shortage. They are problems of abundance. We live in a world where we are technically capable of producing complete abundance.
That I want to get to the bottom of is that the problem is with communism, at some point someone has to do something for something else. There might be abundance, but to organise where something goes requires an individual to exert his own efforts. So it needs individuals giving of themselves to distribute to other people. You can't have a kind of idealist thing and just say, I think everyone should do this. Every individual has to make a decision to distribute things. You need farmers to have the petrol to go into their things, someone to take a risk to do that. You can't have any software or technology that can centrally control and somehow humanely distribute wealth.
Funnily enough,
can you just explain to me, I'd like to put the onus on you to explain to me how you get that around that problem. It seems quite utilitarian what you're saying as well, how for the greater good you can have greater things happen for everyone, if we add it up. But you can have a lot of problems with that. You can have minorities that get left behind and that are sacrificed for the 98% of people apparently who will enjoy these happy lives.
I think if we look at certain technical developments that are happening in recent times, we can see that the collectivist instinct, even if it's just in pursuit of personal objectives, has become quite ubiquitous. The very nature of many of the everyday tools we use for communication, they are collectivist. Whether it be something like Facebook or Google or
by capitalists, people
they don't have to be owned by capitalists.
But they've been developed. That's my point. In the first place, it's great once you have something. Like you're saying, once there's an abundance, great. Let's distribute to everybody. Well, we didn't have Facebook. We didn't have Google before entrepreneurs like Bill Gates came along. They made it happen. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have phones. We wouldn't be able to do the things that you want to do, which are noble things.
I think it's a mistake to look at what exists and assume that its existence. Assume that its existence is due to a socio-economic system. Let me give you an example. The internet itself was not developed by private companies. It was developed by public investment, both by the American state and by other states. Second, by public investment, the internet. The majority of electronic communication in the world, for example, email communication, runs on public sector, or better said, copyleft software. SendMail and other software, Linux software on the servers which run the world's computing. So these again, copyleft. It's not private property, it's public property. Not only is it public property, but it's public property that is amendable and adjustable by anybody who has the competence to amend it. Second, just quickly. Facebook, for example, people assume that it's some sort of genius on the part of Zuckerberg. Zuckerman or Zuckerberg, I can't remember which one it is. Zuckerman or Zuckerberg? Huh? Zuckerberg. The genius on the part of Zuckerberg. In actual fact, some other people come up with the same idea. He basically nicked it off them. And many other people have been working on very similar ideas. The art of these companies, as large corporate entities, is to conquer market share by giving it out free as rapidly as possible, which is just like a viral video. So too, a transformation, a surpassing of the existing framework that we think is natural and normal can happen almost automatically and almost immediately.
I'm on the beer.
Never mind, you're on the beer. You've had too many. You were here for the earlier meeting when you were more sober.
Absolutely.
And how it's developed. If you look at like Tiananmen Square and stuff like that, now it's developed more in a capitalist society. It runs better, and economically, they had a lot of starvations in the 1960s, for instance, and they've come out of themselves because they've become more capitalistic.
Got better pollution.
But they've actually economically and socially done better because they've gone into more of a capitalist society.
This is a big argument. Actually, China is dominated by public ownership. And China was more capitalist in 1989 than it is now. More capitalist. There's a book by a man by the name of Ya Shenghuang. He's done the most detailed study on this question. And he studied all the records of the People's Bank of China and found out that actually the entire investment structure in China is geared towards the public sector. 75% of all investment takes place by the public sector, not by the private sector. The banks don't lend any money, 25% are lent to private sector companies. Most private sector enterprises in China are very small scale. 10 people employed, 15 people employed, like restaurants, bars, cafes, things like that. There are some large entities, generally they're foreign companies, not internal companies of China. And then the really large companies in China are all state-owned companies, all public sector companies. Well, it's changing towards the public sector, away from the private sector. Take, for example, the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, there's been a rise of around, what's the figure? Nearly 15 to 20 million people increased working for the public sector in the last 5 years. You know? And the public sector, in China they say, I think it's Guomin Jintui, which is the state advances, the private sector retreats. That's a phrase used in China at the moment. So it's not quite correct, but it's the general viewpoint advocated, or better said, stated in the West. The reason they state it in the West is because it fits their ideological framework. They want everybody to believe that the world is on an automatic trajectory towards capitalism. That every country's objective is to achieve free markets, democracy, human rights, and the rule of private capital. That's the dream. But where this is not actually the case as a developmental model, as it is in China, then they deny that the public sector is powerful, or as powerful as it is, and invent a concept that, you know, watermelon sellers run the country.
No, but they say that most of the government people, and they have a lot of wealth, they actually leave the country. So isn't that a sign that communism isn't working? If most of the people are trying to leave the capitalist society, the top 20%, most of them leave. So that shows you that, you know, if you're rich, they don't want to be there.
That indicates to you that the country isn't run for the interests of capitalism. Because if the capitalists want to run away, it indicates, as far as they're concerned, something's wrong.
There is a problem if people are leaving. You know, that shows that communism isn't in China.
There are many capitalists in China. I can't. What was the figure? I read a book on it. I was looking at a book on it just a couple of days ago. I think private capitalists in China, 2.3% of the population. 2.3% of the population, private capitalists in China. And that's what the social structure of China is a book. Sorry? Many of them are Communist Party members. There is internal corruption within the regime, which is very widespread. I'm not denying that. But, so have I. But the question is the dynamic of the system, why do they want to leave? One, because the government runs a campaign, like now, they're running a campaign, strike hard against corruption. Actually, the distinction between corruption and capitalism in China is very thin. It's a very small distinction. Because if you want to get rich, you have to rob the state. Because the state's got the resources. So what they do then is, once they find, they run various campaigns. On the one side, it's two-faced. On the one side, massive corruption. On the other side, if they fear that the people will rise up, they arrest the capitalists and put them in prison. So, just now the deputy head of the Reform and Development Commission was arrested. Bo Xilai, they put on charges, I think trumped up charges, but they put on charges like that. So the same dynamic that leads the Communist Party to justify itself by social welfare programs leads them to attack capitalists. That's why the West wants the country to turn into a democracy. Because in a democracy, like Britain, people turn around and say, well, if someone's rich, it's a good thing. In China, if someone's rich, they say, where do you get the money from?
Welfare in China is actually great. There's no free health service. If you don't work, you get no benefits, you get nothing. That's not a communist as such.
I didn't say it's communist. I described the dynamic of development of the country as driven by the public sector. I didn't say it's a communist country. It's run by a communist party. Even they don't say it's a communist country. Right? They say it's social with Chinese characteristics. I don't think it's even socialist. But it is a society which has overthrown capitalism as the dominant force in society. In Britain, the big companies and banks dominate politics. They determine the political agenda of all the political parties. In China, the public sector determines the agenda of the Communist Party. The people do so in this respect, in that if they feel aggrieved, sufficiently aggrieved, they take to the streets. And politics, by taking to the streets, is the dominant force in Chinese politics. Well, it does work because...
If you look at Tiananmen Square 1989, there was a big...
Long time ago.
There was a big upheaval, and look what happened to that. It got squashed straight away. And if you ask the Chinese people nowadays, do you know about it? They don't even know it existed. They think you're making it up.
Well, that's perfectly true, but British people don't know much about the Falklands War. They don't know much about the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan. Right? Or we kill more people in Afghanistan. They don't know much about it. People in China also know about Tiananmen, but they don't want to know. Why don't they want to know? Because as far as they're concerned, it's quite an interesting phenomena. I was on Tiananmen Square. As far as they're concerned, when Tiananmen Square was crushed, yes, at the time, I walked down the streets and people were crying, people were giving the students food and so. But once the movement was crushed, and then they watched what happened to the Soviet Union, people thought, we don't want to go that way. The whole country will collapse, and the people will be in starvation. Living standards improved, the conditions of the masses improved. Consequence of that is they say, well, just as well they crushed the movement. That's actually the attitude most people have. Now, that's why they disregard. A lot of people, first of all, I used to think that as well. But after a while, you think, well, why did they think the crushing of Tiananmen Square was justified? Because their lives improved, their conditions improved, and the stability of the state was maintained. Unlike the Soviet Union and co., which completely collapsed. Living standards in the Soviet Union completely collapsed. Life expectancy for males in Russia now is 55 years of age. It was 68 years of age in 1989.
I think you're forgetting about the starvation and absolute, no one had anything. There was a lot of starvation that happened in Russia and in Eastern Europe.
When?
I don't know exactly, but there was a lot.
Starvation in Russia, yes, in the 1920s and 30s. But in the 1970s... I said the 1920s and 30s. Stalin was in charge then.
They withheld grain from the state.
Yeah, but you can't blame him for hunger. Stalin died in 1953. There was no starvation in the 50s. In the 1940s...
John! 20 million Russians died.
In the 1940s, a different issue. Starvation in Russia happened in the 20s and 30s. But that was a war, my friend. Germany invaded Russia and took even Moscow. What are you talking about? What are you doing? What are you doing? You're in the girl's face. What's the game?
One discussion.
Why did the word ethic under communist Russia evolve as part of the decline? Yeah, with the communists. Was it
in Germany has said, one sec. It's difficult, there's a lot of noise going on. It's difficult, if there's another discussion going on at the same time, it's very difficult to hold a meeting. Germany has said, why wasn't the work ethic as strong in the Soviet Union as it was in China? I don't believe that's correct. I worked in China in the 1990, and the work ethic was this: shushi, have a sleep, have a rest. That was the general work ethic. People were sitting around everywhere. In fact, you'd see people, I was amazed, you could see people, they would just squat on the floor and fall asleep. They'd sit on a bicycle, fall asleep. The work ethic was no better in China than in the Soviet Union. But a dynamic takes place. I mean, the marketplace, in that respect you're right, the marketplace permitted a whip to strengthen the dynamic of energy, of releasing energy of people towards work. The fact of the matter is you can't create communism just by making work easier and providing public sector provision, like as they did in China in the 1970s. Everyone gets an iron rice bowl. That doesn't create communism. It creates a Spartanic socialistic concept without creating socialism itself. So what you had instead, and the Soviet Union had the same thing, in the 1930s you had voluntary energy from the masses to produce and work 7 days a week, some of them. They had Subotnik, work on the Sunday, you know. And then they had Stakhanov. Everyone tried to emulate Stakhanov, be a hero, produce for the society. People would go to Siberia voluntarily to go and build new cities. They would get put in wooden huts in Siberia in the winter to create new cities out of nothing. As well, but it wasn't just that. It wasn't just that. There was a voluntary will to create a new society. Right? But sacrifice is limited in its capacity. You can't create socialism just by sacrifice. Socialism must have material incentive for development, particularly where the country is not economically developed itself. Where you have a very rich country, then maybe you can reduce the material incentive as the primary dynamic. But where you have a backward country, you require material incentive for development. So you have a dual track. On the one side, you have the development of public ownership as the central driving force. On the other side, you have market development and capitalist development in order to maximize the potential to exploit the old system. There's nothing, just one sec, I finished one sentence. When capitalism developed from feudalism, how did the capitalists acquire the money to create their dominance over the kings who had castles, who had land, who had power? How did the capitalists acquire that wealth? They exploited the old system. They grabbed from the lords. They grabbed the land from former lords. They grabbed the land from the churches. They enslaved whole nations. They enslaved Africa. They sold goods, unequal exchange. They took a little bit of glass, sold it or swapped it with the Incas for gold. In this way they acquired enormous resources through unequal exchange with the old system. Yes, they used it. They enslaved the African people, transported them to America and Latin America as a source, as Marx said, the end of Volume 1 of Das Kapital, chapter 24, primitive accumulation of capital. Now, in order to acquire capital for socialism, you also require primitive accumulation, which means you acquire the extra capital from exploiting capitalism. The pre-socialist economic thought must be exploited by the socialist forces to acquire sufficient capital to create socialism. Otherwise, how can you compete against them? World capitalism is more powerful. American companies, Japanese companies, European companies, they can outcompete any Chinese company unless the Chinese company is such a large unified entity that is capable of dealing with the world market. So in that way, I believe that there are elements within the Chinese policy that are correct and that were better than the Soviet policy. After all, why did the Soviet Union collapse and China survive? Must have done something better. Well, yes, but what was the methodology? Yes, but that's only one side of the story. He stated explicitly, well, Deng Xiaoping's idea came from the 1920s in the Soviet Union. It wasn't invented by Deng Xiaoping. It was called the New Economic Policy in the Soviet Union. It was carried out by Lenin. It wasn't carried out by Stalin, invented by Lenin. And that policy was adopted by Deng Xiaoping in 79, and transplanted to China with some variation, but not that much variation. It was fundamentally the same as the Soviet New Economic Policy, but it went on for much longer and proved its efficacy in its ability to develop the economy. And the fundamental criteria that even Deng Xiaoping said was, is it developing the socialist sector of the economy? That was the fundamental criteria. And actually when Deng Xiaoping was still in power, the socialist or the public sector of the economy expanded enormously, even though the private sector also grew.
Because foreigners were coming into the country, and that was due to capitalism.
Too many foreigners.
I looked at the statistics. I looked at the statistics on Chinese economic growth a couple of days ago. And China has grown at an average of over 7%. China has grown at an average of over 7% since 1960. 1960. Now, growth.
You're saying we should do the Chinese model everywhere? It's so successful.
My friend, what growth anywhere is not at the expense of the people?
Oh, please. You're joking. You're joking. Capitalism. Absolutely.
Not at the expense of the people?
Absolutely not. I'm from America, and I went from nothing to something. Nobody gave me anything.
So your personal experience can be transferred to the entire planet.
Absolutely. The problem,
Yeah. No wonder you write such silly pop songs. We are the world.
You picked that one out of the entire music we've created.
Well, because you basically said that. You said, what I did, I got rich, you said, therefore everyone can get rich. No, you got rich because other people remained shit. That's why. You're saying you're a capitalist. You employ people? Do you employ people? Do you employ people? You said you're a capitalist. Do you employ people? No, I didn't ask that. I said, you said you're a capitalist. It's not a fallacious question. It's a definitional question. If you're saying you're a capitalist, I want to just check whether you even know what the term means. Right? So what do you mean? Do you employ people?
I don't personally employ people.
So you're not a capitalist? Is it ridiculous? Why is that? What is it then? What is it then? What is it? Can you have capitalism with nobody being employed?
No, but I don't have to employ them all personally for it to be capitalism.
No, I didn't say you have to.
Yes, you
I said for you to be a capitalist, you have to employ. I didn't say that. I said for you personally to be a capitalist, you have to employ other people.
Nice circle.
Now, as the systemic definition, because we're dealing with a system, you think it's a personal propensity. I'm saying it's a system. We have obviously different usage of the terminology. But if we deal with it at a systemic level, before we come into your individual level, if we ask what is capitalism, and I state to you, can you have capitalism without anybody being employed? No. So in other words, at a systemic level, you accept my definition. You must have people employed to exist as capitalism, right? Now, the secondary conclusion which I'm drawing from that is that you cannot be a capitalist without employing people. That's where you're contending my argument. Now, what do you mean? No, it doesn't mean you're a capitalist. It means you are ideologically affiliated with capitalism. I do understand.
That's the answer. He works for capitalists, but he's not being exploited. He likes his job. He's doing okay.
Yeah, it's okay, but it's
fine.
So capitalism is okay.
Well, I am discussing a definitional question because the gentleman tried to make a blanket statement about his personal experience reflecting the entire nation of the United States of America and by default reflecting the entire world. With that question, I took issue. Now, I do understand that we have terminological problems. People come to the world with different terminological concepts. For example, the United States will say, we are fighting for freedom, and they will bomb people in the name of freedom. I will say, the United States, when it's bombing those people, is fighting for their enslavement. Different definitions have different meanings and result in different people being killed, right? And in different concepts about what is justified to kill or not. Just one second. You have just come in and said, if someone thinks or feels that capitalism is good, that they are a capitalist, right? I agree that you can say that if someone feels that capitalism is good, they have a capitalist psychology. That doesn't mean they are objectively a capitalist. That's what I'm arguing. So I think there is. I'm giving you a definition. I think you can use objective terms. Me. I am making arbitration now to clarify the terms. No, you are discussing, I'm speaking, and someone else is contending what I'm saying. So, how can there be, do we go to a dictionary?
It's too broad a concept.
Is it?
It's too broad, too complex.
It's
defined one way, even 2 ways, or 3 ways.
Well, actually, for more than 150 years, for more than 150 years, the concept of capitalism that I'm explaining has become probably the dominant concept. You might challenge that and have some other concept, but it probably is. I didn't say it was. I didn't say it doesn't. But nevertheless, let me ask you the same question I asked a minute ago. Is it possible to have capitalism where no one's employed?
It's possible to have anything where parameters aren't defined.
I didn't say that.
You can't strictly,
I didn't say that.
Heiko, you can't strictly define parameters. It makes no sense.
Well, I think you can. I think we do it all the time. They're not always perfect, I accept that. For example, we define human beings as a specific creature. We exclude from human beings.
We're philosophical beings, we're spiritual beings, we're economic beings, social beings, all kinds of beings.
But I didn't say that. We define life and death in certain ways. Now we know that after a body is technically defined as dead, that some parts of the body are still alive. Therefore, we have a certain parameter within which we define a grey area. That I don't deny. But to negate the very concept of life and death itself, I think is false. And it lands you in the sphere of religion. I think it does. That's not simplistic. Everything must have some form of definitional characteristic to it.
I'm not going to let you off. Truth is, if anything at all, you're the one being fundamentalistic right now.
I'm not denying that.
You're saying capitalism, you have to employ people. Capitalism isn't just about employing people. It's about all kinds of things. It's about the mentality. It's about the psychology.
I didn't say it's not also about other things. I was dealing with a fundamental definitional concept.
According to the chap, excuse me, do you employ people? That's what he said. According to the chap, do you employ
That's
people?
right.
It isn't strictly about employing people. We're talking about the private ownership of the means of production. If you work for a company and you work, people work
Why
for
would
you.
anyone have the means of production?
No, if you work for people and people work for you, you're a manager of people. You're a capitalist in essence. You do not have to own people for you to be a capitalist. You could be a capitalist in all kinds of ways. You could be a capitalist by being a farmer over there, cutting off all the grass. You could be a capitalist.
I'm talking about a system. The gentleman here doesn't believe that the systemic characteristics that I'm defining are adequate to define the system. He thinks it's an ideological question. You're welcome to that definition. The gentleman didn't propose it, but you're welcome to that definition. I don't think it's useful. I don't think that definition is useful as a tool of analysis of society. But you're welcome to try and use it as that. Try and create a theory on that basis. There are other people who are doing the same as you.
All these guys used it.
Used what?
Trotsky, different meanings of understanding nature, the dialectics of nature, into explaining how things work. You use different meanings, different things, different terms, different concepts.
Oh, no, don't go on to that.
Do you want to go there?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Do you want to go there?
Yeah, let him say his piece.
It's quite clear. We're not debating any longer. You've clarified what your point of view was. I've clarified what my point of view was. But you want to hang on to the same subject continuously. You've made it quite clear what your point of view is. I've understood it. You've understood what mine is. And then you're just going on about it. What for? We're done with that. Let's go to the point. It's not one. You've given your point of view. That's all. Go to BCD.
In nature, the strongest survive. That's what I'm feeling about the capitalism.
I think that's incorrect. Would you mind?
You don't see a lion giving the prey away to others.
Well, a lion is certainly stronger than a human being.
But
why did human beings conquer lions?
Copy is nature, one.
But if the strongest survivors you just stated, I mean, firstly,
Hello, something for you.
Oh my God!
Firstly, the strongest creatures that ever lived on Earth were dinosaurs.
Very nice, very nice.
The very word itself says everything. The ones that survived were the weakest, meekest, tiniest creatures, the mammals, beginning with small little mammals like mice and shrews. Those were the basis from which all subsequent development of species on Earth.
Because of an event we didn't know.
Well, but you were saying it contradicts what you said. This is a natural event. Now, it's not all about you, my friend. Yeah, it's not all about you. The gentleman's saying something. Let me try and respond to what he's saying. First of all, before you chip in, let me try and respond myself to him. Yeah, he did ask me. Now, there are many other creatures on Earth today which are very strong. Are they necessarily the strongest survivor? No. It's a very crude level of dealing with that question, because the question was very crude, right? Human beings don't survive because they're strong. They survive because they're tool-making animals. They're tool-making animals precisely because they're weak. Human beings needed tools in order to survive. And because they made tools and utilised their hand and brain and counterbow's finger and thumb, they were able, through those simple, flexible mechanisms of a weak hand, to create instruments powerful enough to destroy the entire planet. And so it was actually the weakness of human beings that compelled them to collectivist activity, which laid the foundation for their strength vis-à-vis other species and other creatures. So it's not true that human beings survived because they're stronger. Human beings survived because they were collectivist. Most of human history was entirely collectivist.
Yes,
they had no private property at all.
What about hunter-gatherers? They were individuals.
They weren't individuals. They were collectivist communities.
No, together is it? Everything is wrong. We're going to hunt together.
And the hunter-gatherers would collect for the collective. They wouldn't collect just to eat for themselves. They're not like birds, they send the birds out, teach the bird to hunt and everything, and the bird goes off on its own. No, they would collectively gather.
Chances of survival in groups.
Their chance of survival was primarily because they existed collectively and they learnt through tool making to create agriculture and to satisfy the wants of the community. The emergence of class structure, the emergence of inequality within those communities based on property was laid actually by the production of a surplus over and above what we required. All animals satisfy their wants from nature, right? From ants to worms to lions. They go out into the earth and satisfy their wants. So it is our society where private ownership means that the wealth that we produce does not belong to us. It's in our society where we produce in abundance and yet we struggle to survive. No other creature does that. The other creatures are more primitive than us. We take the worm, the amoeba. It's a much more primitive species. And yet, all of them find in nature all they require. So, human beings don't do that. Human beings can do that. In fact, the problem lies that we produce way above what we require. That's why capitalism exists. Because when you employ someone, they produce far more than it takes to pay them. And that surplus goes into the hands of a class which owns and controls the means of production, owns and controls the land, and thereby controls the earth. And utilises their power over the earth to create nation states, armies, wars, governments that control the planet and reshape the planet in their interests.
Animals do that as well in their habitats. But
no animal has a nation state.
But that's because they have habitats. Yeah, colonies.
Nation state.
It's like a nation state. Colonies.
No, it's not like a nation state.
Why don't they have a queen? They have a queen and they have.
But it's not a nation state.
Worker ants.
These are definitions by human beings imposed upon ants. They don't have. They are. The ant doesn't have that definition itself. The ant acts according to instinctual drives within the species itself.
Like we do, you have instinctive drives.
But we're not controlled by instinctive drives. We're controlled by economic structures, man-made structures.
What about the will to have power over others?
This is why the community of the ant exists for millions of years in existing form. The community of society is transformed every year. Fundamentally transformed. If you compare the earth of today, the way we live today, with the way we lived even 100 years ago, let alone 1,000 or 1,000,000 years ago, it's utterly transformed. And it's transformed by tool making, by the ability to shape and alter nature, and the way in which the tools that we make from nature are used against us.
Regardless, things might change, but we still have an elite class subjugating the lower classes. You know, it's the same format, but just something different.
That's an interesting phenomenon. Because, as I said, ants existed for millions of years. In fact, I don't know how old they are, but probably 50 million years or so, ants have existed. In pretty much the same format, pretty much the same format of existence. Human society, in the present format, is a very modern phenomenon. We're talking about a few hundred years. Most of human society, however, if you go to the British Museum, you'll see, we had one tool. It was universal. Everybody, every community on Earth had the same tool. It was the hand axe. The hand axe made human beings. Or better said, making the hand axe made human beings. And people left Africa. 1.4 million years ago, we found the earliest hand axe. In Piccadilly Circus, they found a hand axe 500,000 years old. So for 500,000 years, human beings lived in the same way. And we know these hand axes were used even 30,000 years ago. So for over 1,000,000 years, we used the same tools. And therefore, we lived the same way. For nearly 1,000,000 years. And throughout that period, there was no private property and people lived collectively. So you can't say that human beings cannot live collectively, Because for the majority of human history, 98% of human history, human beings did live like that. And actually, even capitalism, underneath the surface of organising for exploitation, the majority of people live in a collective farm. How else can we live? 7 million people in a city. Yes, we hear about violence, paedophilia and so on, but it's a minority affair. The majority of people live peaceably and collectively for the majority of the time, right? Except when you go to work, when you're exploited. You're exploited just as surely as a robber who comes up and steals your watch. Every single day. If you go to work in McDonald's, or the girl working here behind the counter, she is producing in a day, let's say she sells or produces extra value over and above the cost and sale, extra value maybe £300 a day. They pay her £50. She has produced £250 more than she receives. Just as surely as someone coming and robbing you of your arm every day, of your watch, that's what's happening to her. And that's why people in Britain have to pay rent to the landlord. You think we haven't? Look, Irish people built London 100 years ago.
A robber doesn't give them £50. She gets £50. A robber doesn't take your watch and give you £50. Oh, it's different.
Well, what's the difference? I said she loses or she produces £300. She receives. I mean, let me give you an example just to show you what this is. Some dodgy guy in Notting Hill tried to sell me a video camera. He turns around and he goes, "Yeah, take 80 quid." I said, all right, I'll give you 80 quid. Then he was sitting in the car, he had it in a plastic bag, he's sitting in the car, and then his mate turned around and said, "Don't take fucking 80 quid, it's much too cheap." And then I turned my back like that, and he goes, no, it's fine, it's fine. I turned around and he gave me a bag. I took the bag, gave him the 80 quid, drove off like that. I opened the bag, potatoes. So a robber does give you something, even if it's just a lesson. And they were the most expensive potatoes I've ever eaten. I'm pleased they made a £250,000 burger now, because I thought I was being robbed. Now at least we know there are more. Are you going to eat there? You're a vegetarian. Are you going to eat the burgers? There you go. See, there we go. We've got a revolution happening in Speaker's Corner.
Made of elephant's foot.
Well, nowadays they're talking about recreating mammoths. And they could create mammoths probably the size of Hyde Park if they genetically engineer them. But we don't need to do that. We can just make the mammoth meat, mammoth burger, on the plate in 5 years. Of course you can do it.
They already made one a few days ago.
Mammoth burger, not beef burger. Where were we?
How do you know those for 500,000 years people, you said now, there were axes everywhere, as an indicator that society was similar?
Chapter 3, the world in 100 objects.
No, what I mean is, how do you know there were no capitalistic overtones in those societies? How do you know they were purely shared collective?
The knowledge about society and the history of society is derived from archaeology. Archaeology studies the way in which human societies have been organised according to tool making and the type of communities that they can discover. And so the emergence of slavery, Greece, Assyria, Egypt, Rome, is a very specific transformative characteristic based on enslaving a large majority, a small minority having rights. But before this period, every community you'll look at, if you look back historically, you'll discover these communities were, the further back in time you go, you'll find these communities entirely collectivist. This is what we know.
So that does have capitalist undertones.
These are emergencies later. The initial periods, before you had any monetary, I mean money in China,
hunter-gatherers or...
Money came about, earliest money is 5,000 years ago, right? Human beings have existed, or hominids have existed 1.4 million years. Human beings in a modern form, 100,000 years. So we know that if 5,000 years out of 100,000 years, it's a very short period to have money. I mean, Chinese money, cowrie, shells, it was 5,000 years ago.
No problem with bartering system and trading of
I'm
goods.
not discussing the merits of it, I'm discussing the actual reality of it. Now, whether that's good or bad is another question. In fact, that, in my opinion, it's a bad thing. In my opinion, money, capitalism was necessary and progressive. Even slavery was progressive. But the description about collectivism, about being innate, that was the question we were discussing. What is innate to the human being? What is innate to species? That's what we were discussing. So I was describing, well, history doesn't actually give you an innate characteristic of struggle for survival and superiority. The strongest survive. Sorry? Yes, but the evolution of human society was founded on collectivism. And in fact, even slave society, or capitalism today, is actually founded on an organised collectivism from above. If they didn't collectively organise thousands of slaves, you could never have the pyramids of Egypt. If you didn't collectively organise people to work for London Transport, there'd be no transport in London. So you require collective organisation.
Tobacco and sugar in the West Indies?
Sorry?
And tobacco and sugar in the West Indies?
Same thing. Tobacco and sugar in the West Indies.
It produced the same way, collective.
Well, they're all collectivist organisations. I mean, the very nature of modern, even pre-modern society, in what we call civilization. In other words, after slavery in Egypt, Greece, Rome. If we talk about modern society, the civilization, these are all founded upon collectivism, organised collectivism from above.
There are failures in collectivism, Russian collectivism in agriculture.
Well, I'm not disputing that.
So you can't say that's the end-all answer to everything. Collectivism can cause...
I didn't say it was. What I said was...
Racial segregation, racial tension, it can create all sorts of problems.
The issue was not that. I was asked if the struggle for survival, the strong survival of the fittest, was the foundation of human development. And I'm negating that by arguing that human development historically has been based on various collectivist forms, starting with collectivism with no private property and emerging into collectivist organisation based on private property.
You refute things like Darwin then?
It's not a refutation of Darwin. It's not a refutation of Darwin. Darwin didn't just say that creatures survive by struggling one against another. He said they adapt to circumstances, environmental conditions, which compel them to transform their nature.
If we're all collective then, and then a change of circumstance occurs, and we have to become more capitalistic, what do you say about that then?
I think the reverse process is happening. I think that what we have is such a level of collective unity across the entire planet that actually what is required is the end of capitalism and the establishment of a society based on that collectivism.
But then that might be an organic process where we go back to being capitalistic then.
I don't think so, but there may be. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
So
I don't believe it's not. Utopian is a belief that has no connection with the objective reality. I don't believe that is the case with what I'm arguing. For the very simple reason that the objective reality, it has created a collectivist world. For example...
No, you're nihilistic. What you should be asking for is a reform of the current status quo. You can't be talking about destroying everything and rebuilding on the ashes. You should be talking reform of the capitalist system, not being nihilistic.
I don't believe it is reformable.
I think it is.
I don't believe it. For the very simple reason, let me give you a very simple reason, take it back to a very simplistic level, and I'll finish on this. If you rent a property, let me try and reply to you. If you rent a two-bedroom flat in that block at the end there, and you're paying the landlord every week £600 a week, with that £600 a week he lives. He owns the house already.
He takes a yearly ground rent, which is his right because the land...
For a two-bedroom flat in that place, guarantee you at least £600.
For a what?
Guarantee you. Every week. Every week. Rent in that place, £600. Guaranteed. Guaranteed. Now, if that person owns it through skill or having his inherited or whatever it is, he's getting £600 a week paid. Now, once he gets that £600, if you turn around and say to him, I'm not paying you, he's going to go mad. He's going to call the police, call a judge, expel you from your house. So, there is no reform of that.
That's a product of English history. The French had this...
Not just English history.
What the French did
it's about property rights. Property rights.
You have to put it in the historic context. Britain evolved from feudalism to capitalism without the bloody coup, without the killing that was involved in France.
Correct.
So
there was a civil war in England. There was a civil war in England. The king's head was chopped off.
Kill off all the landlords like the French did.
Well, many of the landlords had killed themselves in the Wars of the Roses.
Compromise with the landowners. Say instead of killing you off, the people will give you a sum of money for the land you own, which is, I think, is very sensible.
Well,
you have to look at it into its historic.
I think you're incorrect in your history. Britain's history was not.
Which is worth nothing for an asset which is
grow food and it's small people. Yeah, well, I can't see that. And then, okay, if that is a problem, how would you reform it?
What is the problem?
That we're giving money to these landlords.
I don't think you can reform the existing structure of that type of relationship. I think you fundamentally need to overthrow it. Now, a way to do that would be, for example, in landlordism in Britain, you could introduce a law in Britain, that's what I would suggest, that would, for example, guarantee that anybody who can't pay their mortgage would be transformed to a rental contract. The rental contract would be with a public bank, and the banks are already mostly public at the moment, would be with the public bank. So in other words, the property that is presently private will become publicly owned. Right? Now,
Excuse me, sir.
just one second, let me clarify what we're saying.
I don't think you answered his question.
I'm trying to answer one question. If you allow me to finish it, then you can see. I believe also that rental should be forced downwards by law. That's very simple to do. All you have to do is reintroduce the law that existed in the 1980s, whereby a rent officer would come to the property and specify the maximum rent that could be charged for that property. They have laws like that in Germany, in France, in Sweden. Rent control. Now, in this way, we would reduce the total expenditure that people expend on housing. We would increase the available money, disposable income of the majority of the population who are spending their money on landlordism, and be able to restructure part of the economy. However, I believe that there's a very powerful lobby in Britain who would oppose that. And many of them would try to oppose that by whatever means necessary. That's just one area of economics.
So what is reforming?
I'm all in favour of attempting to reform, but I don't believe reform is possible. I believe revolutionary change is the only methodology which will work. Because once you begin to reform and these people feel threatened, they organise violence against you. But I'm all in favour of the possibility.
Can I ask a question? Would you be in favour of reform, or would you say no more reform, it's got to collapse and then start again? Because all the time you have reform, it'll just keep going on and on and on.
I'm all in favour of reform. In a period of economic boom, you're more likely to get reform. In a period of economic crisis, suddenly everyone's supposed to have their legs cut off, tighten their belts. 5.5% fall in income in 5 years. Right? That's what we've had. Actually, income, if normal income increases would have been calculated, we've probably had a loss of maybe 30% of income. So, here you have an idea. This is not something they're discussing with the general public. What should we do? They're imposing it upon the people. Therefore, I believe that ultimately the only way to change that is to impose it as well. But I'm all in favour of trying to pass a law to do it. All in favour.
Excuse me, sir. If I'm wrong, correct me, both of you. I think his original question was reforming capitalism as the whole system, and Marxism, because both systems have failed. Capitalism, you get 47 million with no health insurance and tens of thousands living on the bridge, and the people with own billions. That, in my view, that's a failure. However, on the other hand, the opposite extreme, you get people who guarantee their wages, come to work 9 o'clock, have the coffee, read the paper, you guarantee their houses, everything, they don't produce, no productivity. Can you reform both, where you can get something in between, where you give incentive to make people work, but at the same time, don't guarantee everything for them. You just come and sit here, lunchtime comes, go spend 2 hours, come back full with food. It's just, can you get something in between? Because capitalism, if you look at capitalism, probably you got my question anyway.
I got it.
That's what I think originally he meant. Can you reform capitalism? Because while it's sexy and nice and you make a lot of money, but other people left out of.
Although it was quite
where Marxism
strange, our friend's remark here, there's validity to it.
Sorry?
He said, we can lash them. Now, but I think, but it's not just silly. There's validity to it. The validity is this. On the one side, the technical abilities of human beings rise with every day and every minute. So that's one consideration which you must account for the behavior of human beings. Everybody knows that the world is advancing technically, scientifically, and culturally, at least in the generic sense of raising education, general knowledge of the population and so on. Everybody knows that, except in your case. So they what?
China. So there isn't an advance.
In the last sentence. The last sentence.
I said, so there isn't an advance. You said there's an advance. There isn't one.
What I was talking about was the general advance in science, technology and culture. So in other words, as people's education increases, as people's exchange of information increases, as science and technology develops, human beings can produce more in less time. That happens on a minute by minute, second by second, day by day basis. Everybody who is educated knows that, right? So it's natural for human beings to think, surely the way we live should improve all the time.
Incentives, basically, in other words.
That is an incentive in the minds of the people. So one way in which people sometimes exploit that is to be lazy, to reduce the amount that they do. Capitalism is based upon the idea that you will basically, you treat the worker as a lazy beast and you compel them by offering incentive, some money, or whipping them, threaten them with some action if they don't do what you want. So you might sack them, you might threaten to reduce their benefits, you might lobby the government to cut back on welfare payments and so on and so forth. So, is there a mechanism that connects the two? I think there is. I think you require regular reductions in the working week, regular improvements in living standards for the majority, improvements in healthcare, welfare, education, at the same time as offering incentives, improved living conditions, better wages, better conditions on the basis of increasing productivity. But I believe people will do that when they feel that it serves the people. It serves them and the people. The two things connected together. So I'm not against using the whip in those circumstances.
Listen, I lived through both systems. This socialism where everything guaranteed. No, I don't want your thing. Take that away.
My camera.
While is your camera? Why should I have it? I lived through both systems where I experienced both ideologies. And then from my point of view, I'm not going to start a new ideology, but I'm just saying from my point of view, there is a
the middle way. It's going viral tonight.
Because there are two extremes. You understand what I'm saying? I understand capitalism encourages productivity, gives more incentive. If I work in a factory for you, if you give me incentive, tell me if you produce 10 items per day, I give you more. But if you produce only 7, that's what you're going to get. Naturally, I will work more, so I produce 3 extra more, so I'll make more money.
The problem is this, though.
No, just wait a minute. Whereas in socialism, if the factory is owned by the state, and I work, so you're my manager, or you're the minister of industry, whatever it is, you guarantee me everything. My flat, education of my children, health, my wages. Why should I bust my stomach? Now, it's clearly the price of both systems, you could see it. In capitalism, it's so ruthless. As you mentioned, you 7 minutes ago, you said you're going to whip them, or you're going to do whatever, punish them, whatever it is. There are 47 million, no, I'm just saying, I know. But there are 47 million are not covered by health insurance in the United States alone. There are tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, all over the United States alone, sleeping on the bridge homeless. Even former Vietnam soldiers, former war veterans, and the rest of it. That's just the United States alone. Look at this country. Everywhere. Now, these are two extreme systems. If some genius somewhere, maybe you, produce something in the middle.
Definitely me.
Produce something in the middle where give some humanity to people. You're coming with your camera, aren't you?
Don't worry.
This cheating, all right? Where you can reduce the effect, the ruthlessness of capitalism. You stay there, camera.
Finish your question very fast.
No. and at the same time, you reduce some of this laziness that people is taken for granted. They will get everything. This is my question.
I think
and
actually,
that's where the gentleman he said. I think
respond.
he said reform capitalism.
That's a very long question. You have to pay for it.
I think
No,
if
you should have to pay me for my expertise question.
You didn't let me to film you.
No,
I want to finish on this. I'm going to finish on this on a quick response.
Yes,
I think that fundamentally, in the countries that were called socialist countries, that the lack of incentive was associated with a lack of consumer goods. If you have consumer goods available, then people will work hard. I mean, look, in China, they still have public ownership of the decisive levers of the economy, and people work hard. 20 years ago, they worked less hard, right? Now,
No, I think you
let me
know
try and
something.
respond. You've got a
There
different
is
opinion than me. I'm trying to say.
introduced later on.
I'm trying to say.
There's incentive. That's why they work hard.
Well, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about what the mechanisms are. It's not just because of that. We're talking about what mechanisms exist that can allow you to incentivize people to work harder on top of having certain provision. For example, in Sweden has one of the highest living standards in the world. But the productivity of labour is far higher than Britain or than China. Right?
Quality of life as well.
And the quality of life. But the social provision in Sweden is actually higher than in most former Soviet countries, even today. So it's not true.
High taxes though.
Well, yes, but that's another
Hey,
question.
Lord Kronos.
You were talking about principles.
Yeah.
You weren't talking about specific examples.
You talk about the outcome basically. Yeah.
Right. So it's not true that it's automatic that a low productivity of labour follows from having high welfare provision. Germany, France, Sweden, Denmark, Holland all have welfare provision far higher than America, Britain, Ireland, or the classical neoliberal economic structures. The point about China was not about its welfare provision. The point about China was there you still have public ownership as a decisive lever of the economy, and yet they've been able to incentivize people in the work ethic precisely because consumer goods production encourages people to accumulate and to work harder. So the lack of availability of consumer, I lived in East Germany. In East Germany, consumer goods were very limited. And the consumer goods were so expensive that at least high technology consumer goods were so expensive. A television, you worked half a year for a television. But everything else was almost free. Food, clothing, shelter, almost free. And so the drive to incentivize, I believe, could have been helped by focusing more on consumer production. So that's a very simple answer. It's not got a detailed answer, but it's a simple answer. I'm going to finish on that. Thanks very much. See you again another time.
Take care.